The life of a sports reporter is not for the faint of heart. Many dedicate their entire careers, their entire lives, to the pursuit of a story worthy of being told. The stories themselves are appreciated by millions, but the storytellers, not so much. Who are they? What is their story? What have they learned from this crazy adventure? It's the storytellers that always have the neatest stories. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Storytellers Stories. I'm Haley Kate Webb, and I'm joined here today by Bob Holt. Bob has been covering the Arkansas Razorbacks since 1981. He's a member of the Football Writers Association of America. He's a voter for the Heisman Trophy and the AP Top 25 for basketball, and has been awarded the Arkansas Sportswriter of the Year 3 times. Bob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, glad to do it.
Okay, I just kind of want to start off and talk about when and why you picked up sports writing, and then touch on whether or not you always wanted to cover the Razorbacks or if that is just something that worked its way out.
Well, growing up, I liked writing and I really loved sports. And I went to a really small high school in southeast Missouri in a town called Cape Girardeau. That we had like 40 kids in our senior class. So even somebody like me could play basketball. And probably can't tell by looking at me now, but I was a lot thinner back then. But I obviously wasn't good enough to play beyond small high school sports. But so something I could do to stay involved was to cover it. And then growing up in Missouri, just by happenstance, the University of Missouri has a really good journalism school. And I always wanted to go there anyway. After I went to a football game there, when I think I was a sophomore in high school, really exciting. Saw Oklahoma come back and beat Missouri back in the 70s. The dark ages, probably something like you. But so it's a combination of, really loving sports, loving writing. And I knew about Arkansas growing up because, we were just north of Arkansas. And I remember watching the Orange Bowl when Arkansas beat OU, Lou Holtz's first season in 77. And I knew about the triplets, when they went to the Final Four in 78. But basically, we had you have to remember the technology back in 1981 when I graduated, like it is now. People weren't emailing or basically we had a job board at the J school where you walked by and there was a big bulletin board and people had jobs, pinned on it, like, the Austin American Statesman's looking for a news writer, or the Tulsa World's looking for a copy editor, or whatever the job might be. And actually, I had a friend, Jeff Krupsaw, who was working at the Democrat. It was the Arkansas Democrat at the time before it merged with the Gazette. And I think he called and put out the word that, hey, there's a sports writing job in Fayetteville. He actually turned it down because he really loved horse racing. He liked to go to Hot Springs. He was working in Woodlock at the time. And so it was interesting because me and a couple other guys who were good friends, we all went for the job. And I guess I was just a good fit. But I felt very fortunate to I got a job covering the Razorbacks out of college. Of course, our paper was a lot smaller than, I think it was around 60,000 circulation. And it had just switched from PM, which means afternoon edition, to a morning edition to kind of go head to head with the Arkansas Gazette, which was much more established. So yeah, in June, I think it was late June. I felt really lucky to have a job because a lot of people didn't get jobs that quick. It was very stressful. You didn't really want to go back home and live with your parents after you got a college degree. Right. You didn't have if you didn't have a job, you'd have a lot of choices. And so I felt really fortunate to get a job, and a job that I thought covering the Razorbacks would be great. Didn't know I'd be doing it 40 years later, but the job kind of evolved into something. It was a good job at the time, but it really was kind of an entry-level job, and it evolved into a better job. The paper improved. Mm-hmm. And but I always tell people that I could cover the Yankees for the New York Times. I probably wouldn't. The audience I'm trying to reach here in Arkansas, they wouldn't care. Like, the people in New York don't care anymore about the Yankees than the people in Arkansas do about the Razorbacks. I always felt like, it was a really good job covering a major college, but also, you had an audience that really, really was interested in what you were doing. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was very appealing too.
Do you think you've developed into a Razorback fan at all, or just a writer for them?
No, you really can't be a fan and cover the team. I mean, you can be, but it's not a good way to go. I'm
Yeah.
definitely a fan of the people I cover, and that I think they're really good people and they're good to deal with, and I wish them well and all that. But you really can't root for the team. I tell people this, if you're a fan and you cover a game, then if they win and you're all excited, you really can't do your job. You kind of got to analyze the stats and what's going on in the game and be formulating in your head what am I going to write.
Mm.
Like for instance, last week I've not been traveling with the team because we have some media restrictions. Tom Murphy, our beat guy, goes, and also all the post game interviews, just like this, they're on Zoom. So I
Mhm.
could be in Fayetteville, I could be at the game, I could be in Timbuktu. If I got internet access, I can get the post game interviews.
Right.
And so watching the game last week, I had to file some notes by the end of the third quarter. So you kind of write about what's happened up to that point, and you hope nothing too crazy happens afterwards. And then I was sitting there looking at the stats, and you have That's something you have stat broadcasts. You can keep up with the play-by-play. Literally, they update the stats after each play. And I looked, and I knew Arkansas wasn't doing very good on third down conversions offensively. I knew A&M was doing real well. And at this point in the third quarter, A&M was 7 of 8 on third downs. Arkansas had been the best in the SEC at stopping teams on third downs. They were only allowing about 30%. A&M was like at 88% or whatever 7 of 8 is. And so I sort of started forming in my head, okay, I'm going to write my sidebar on that. So as the fourth quarter was going on, I was watching the game, but I also was writing about that. So, if I'm sitting there going, oh, well, what's going to happen next? I got to analyze the game sort of as an observer, not as a fan. And then if they win late and you're all excited and jumping around, you really can't do your job either. So you have to be I think you have to take a fan's perspective of being very interested in every aspect of the team, but you can't really get emotionally involved in the outcome. Otherwise, you really can't do your job like you should.
Yeah, that does make sense. Oh, yeah, I kind of want to go back to early on in your career because you were talking about the triplets and everything that was going on. Was it ever intimidating as an early sports writer to walk into a room and have to talk to, I don't know, Nolan Richardson or guys of that uh, high caliber?
Well, when I first started, Eddie Sutton was the basketball coach, and Lou Holtz was a football coach. And I have to admit, I covered Norm Stewart at Missouri, and he could be a pretty intimidating guy. He was a great coach, and I think Norm Stewart sort of especially with young writers, and he dealt with a lot of those at Missouri because of the J school. I think he sort of wanted to test you, and then he wouldn't be like mean or anything, but I think he sort of wanted to test you to see kind of what kind of mettle you had. METTLE, not M,
Yeah.
and but I covered him and had a good time. I think that really actually prepared me pretty well for covering Lou Holtz or Eddie Sutton or Nolan Richardson or whoever I might run into here as far as coaches I covered. And I do remember going in to see Lou Holtz one-on-one. I guess I was 21. And it was kind of intimidating because, he was the guy that had orchestrated the big upset over OU. He'd been on Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Johnny Carson, but he used to host The Tonight Show for many, many years. And if you're on The Tonight Show back then, you had 3 channels. You didn't have 300 channels. So that was a little intimidating. Not that he was, mean or anything, but I remember being kind of nervous. But yeah, Eddie Sutton, big time coach, and when Nolan Richardson replaced him, big time coach, back to back Hall of Fame coaches, Naismith Hall of Fame coaches. Those guys are probably in 25 Hall of Fames between them, but the Naismith Hall of Fame is the biggest. Like Nolan Richardson called the granddaddy of them all,
Mhm.
and kind of like the Rose Bowl is for football games. And so I think by the time Nolan Richardson came in, I'd covered Eddie Sutton, Lou Holtz, and Norm Stewart at Missouri, so I was a little better prepared. But yeah, that's something I think as a young writer you kind of got to get over. You can't really be in awe of these people. You can certainly respect them and admire them, but you can't really be in awe of them because you really can't cover somebody that, like, if you want their autograph or something like that. That you got to see them as people and as coaches that you cover. Just like if you're covering politics, you're covering the governor or maybe the president or senator. You got to see them as people.
Yeah. In a recent, or not recent, a couple years ago, an article written about you, they deemed you as, quote, fearless with a microphone and said you had aggressive interview tactics. Can you elaborate on how you developed that reputation?
Yeah, I don't know if it's deserved or not. I basically just try to have a natural curiosity about things, like I always write down questions if I'm going into an interview, or like that was from SEC media days. we get coaches and then we get players. The coaches are up this big podium. You have to raise your hand, and now you have to stand up because it's on ESPN or whatever, the SC Network, whatever that gets on. And they put everything on television now. And so I would write down things because, like I said, me and my coworker, Tom Murphy, we do something on every team that's there. We make it like a 2-week series. We even did that this year, even though there was no media days. You just had to kind of check with media friends and look and see what's out there on the internet because coaches were doing Zooms with their local media. But yeah, I just never looked at it as anything like out of the ordinary. Just have, do your research, find out about the team, what's going on, who they lose, who they have coming in, and ask the coaches about it. And some of the coaches don't get a lot of questions. Obviously, Nick Saban at Alabama and Dan Mullen at Florida or Kirby Smart at Georgia, they get a lot of questions. Sometimes the coach at Vandy or Kentucky or even Arkansas, obviously we have a lot of questions for Arkansas. They don't get as many questions. So I think I've developed a bit of a reputation. But if I was doing a Vandy preview, I had to get some stuff. Other guys they're there to get this or that. They don't really care about Vanderbilt, for example. So I guess I got a little bit of a reputation. But to me, it's just, natural curiosity, kind of doing your homework, showing some interest. We're there to ask questions. So otherwise, what's the point? If you're not there to ask questions, you can just stay home and watch it on TV,
Yeah. There to ask questions. I love that. And I kind of want to touch on like the hard questions. They always talk about in sports, the hard stories to cover and the hard questions and how you have to ask them. You can't let them go by without asking about them. And so I just want to know what your perspective is and your mindset going into asking the hard questions and covering the hard stories.
Well, I think you can ask hard questions in a respectful way. It's real easy to be on Twitter and make fun of somebody who maybe, they might be a coach that's fighting for their job. That's a pretty serious, thing. I mean, whether or not you're going to get fired or not. But sometimes that's a valid question to ask. It's kind of the elephant in the room, I was watching Sports Center, I think, or maybe it was the NFL Network the other night, and the San Diego Chargers coach, whose name escapes me, but they'd had a tough loss. They've had a bunch of just close losses. I think they're 1-5 or something. And somebody asked him, "Hey, are you worried about your job?" I don't think they did that. I don't think they did that in a light way or like they relish doing it. It was just probably something that's been talked about for 3 weeks and it's out there. And hey, what does the coach think? So I think you can ask those questions directly but respectfully. And the coach basically said something like, "Well, I'm paraphrasing here. This is an exact quote. He basically said, well, yeah, I'd be a fool not to be thinking about my job. Because, in the NFL, you don't get a whole lot of, you don't go in with 5-year rebuilding plans in the NFL. If you lose for a couple of years, you're probably going to get fired. They back Monday or whatever after the NFL season ends, and usually 4 or 5 guys get fired, maybe more within a week. And so I thought that was a good example of somebody asking a direct question and getting a direct answer. The coach didn't get all defensive and say, "How can you ask me that?" Or "What do you think?" He said, "Yeah, you worry about it, but I can't, I can't be focused on that. I've got to focus on the team and winning." But I remember, Hugh Freeze was the Ole Miss coach, came to media days. He was under a lot of fire because there'd been NCAA allegations about cheating. There'd been scandals about, him misusing his cell phone for, let's just say, off the field things. And that was a big question. Is this guy get? And we thought he might get. We weren't sure he was going to make it to media days. And so I remember asking him, and I remember thinking, okay, there's a way to do this without being salacious or acting like you work for TMZ. And I'd have to go back and look it up because they do transcripts of this. But I think I said something like, "Are you worried about your job?" or "How concerned are you about the NCAA allegations?" Because he had denied them, but he's also the head coach, and usually it falls back on him. And he, you could tell it was a little uncomfortable for him, but he answered it. And then honestly, within about 2 weeks later, he got fired, or he resigned under pressure. That I always try to write that. So, because sometimes people resign, they don't, because they're going to get fired, but they resign that the AD or the school gives them the option. So I always try to write. It's like Lou Holtz, he essentially got fired here in 1983 after the 83 season, but he resigned. So I always write, he resigned under pressure. It wasn't like it was his idea.
Right.
And so I think they're a way to ask those questions, respect. Sometimes, a team makes a question like a coach, is down the goal line and you think, well, he should give the ball to his running back. And they try a pass and backfires and doesn't work, well, you don't need to say, Coach, why did you make that dumb call? Or, what were you possibly thinking there? Why didn't you run the ball? You say, hey, what was the strategy there at the goal line? Why didn't you give it to so-and-so? You don't have to be accusatory. I mean, I think you say, I'm asking you the question. I'm giving you a chance to explain yourself because the readers / fans, the people I'm serving, they want to know why. And the coach might have a really good explanation for you. Sometimes, in baseball, it's a big thing. You want to get like a lefty-lefty matchup. You want a left-handed pitcher to pitch to a left-handed hitter. And so sometimes you might, the coach might use a right-handed pitch hitter, and you're thinking, why'd you do that? So you have somebody like Dave Van Horn at Arkansas, who's a great guy, great coach, great quote, as we say. And Dave might say, well, you guys aren't privy to our scouting reports, but actually this pitcher or this hitter was batting, 122 against lefties, and he was batting 310 against righties. So that's why we brought in the left-hander to face him, because, goes against the book. He hits right-handers better than left-handers. That doesn't make sense statistically, but sometimes and so that's a really good explanation. You can use that for your readers, and they can say, oh, well, that's why he did it, So a lot of times, you just ask and let the coach or the player, whoever it might be, just explain themselves.
Yeah. You mentioned early on there about how they transcript every interview at least the media days. And it reminded me when you were talking in Mr. Tim Hamilton's class about your notebook that you have and how you keep that notebook going and you refer back to it.
Yeah, there it is right there.
There it is. Well, I'm just curious how many of those that you have and how often you do go back and pull something from a previous interview.
Oh, yeah. Nowadays, when I first started doing this in the 80s, there'd be like maybe 4 people covering an Arkansas practice, football practice, basketball practice. They were wide open, Nolan Richardson fans could go. When Arkansas was really good in the 90s, it was not unusual for 300 fans to be at Walton Arena watching a practice. It really wasn't. I'm not saying it was like that every day, but when they were winning, the national championship and going to Final Fours, there was obviously a lot of interest. And so, but back then you could really talk to a coach every day. Like we used to talk to Lou Holtz, Kenny Hatfield, Houston Nutt, Jack Crow, whoever the coaches were at the time. We talked to them literally every day. We'd go out and watch practice. We'd see what was going on, who was hurt. And the coach would come over and he'd talk to 4 or 5 of us, however many was there. And we'd ask him about, hey, so why was so-and-so missing? He'd give a very detailed injury update, which I don't do now. And you'd say, well, and I saw so-and-so move from tight end to a linebacker or whatever it might be. You got very detailed reports on post-practice. And we talk to the coach every day. So nowadays, like, for instance, we get Sam Pittman on a Zoom call on Monday for about 20 minutes, and we have him on the SEC teleconference. On Wednesdays, they each get 10 minutes. Sometimes they go 11 or 12, but it's generally 10. 10 minutes is what they're supposed to get. And you'd be surprised how many questions you can get in 10 minutes if the coach doesn't, just go crazy on his answers, as far as being long-winded. And then we get them on Thursdays. And that's pretty good. Some coaches talk Monday and on the teleconference, and that's it. Arkansas makes Sam available on Thursdays late in the week, so that's good. I'm not complaining; it's just the way it is. What I'm getting at is, when I started doing this 40 years ago, you got the coach every day, so you could kind of say, okay, well, I'll have to ask him about that tomorrow. Now you get a coach 3 times, and you're not getting them. It's not 4 or 5 of you on a Zoom; it might be a dozen of you, and everybody has their own questions, and they do a good job of kind of going, okay, Bob, what do you have? Tom, what do you have? Haley, what do you have? Whatever the case might be. And so I guess the good thing is somebody else might have a good idea and a good line of questions you hadn't thought about. And you're like, wow, that's pretty good. Now we all have that. And then sometimes you're trying to ask a line of questions and you're going to write a story later in the week and other people are going to take that and use it tomorrow. That's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I definitely, ask a coach something Monday that I might use for a story for Saturday, or I might even use it for next week. What I try to do is really use every opportunity and save it. And, because, you might use it, if it's got some shelf life, you might use it a month from now. Mm-hmm. Or you might go back and say, I use that, but it's applies to this story. I mean, you don't really want to duplicate quotes a lot, but you might say, well, I use this, but it's germane to this topic now too, so I'm going to use it. But yeah, I think you have to be very resourceful and don't waste any of this interview time because it's very limited now.
Especially now, yeah. I'm laughing because I listened to Sam Pittman's press conference from Thursday, and you started asking him about his musical career, his background in playing guitar or whatever he played, and it got me. Yeah, it got me thinking: is that like those little random nuggets? Is that ever something that you might come back to and use for like a feature story or something, or is that just to get him talking?
Well, no, I mean, I was not aware of Sam's musical talents. Ty Richardson, who's on a radio show here in the mornings, I was just listening to it in Fort Smith, and Ty was smart enough. I'll give Ty credit. He asked Sam about, and maybe during their open date, Sam did a lot of TV and radio spots, and I heard some of them, didn't hear all of them, and so I don't know if Ty had heard this from somebody, or I don't know if Sam mentioned it in a previous interview or what, but Ty asked, that Sam made the famous jukebox comment after they beat Mississippi State. Turn that jukebox on. Well, of course, they didn't have a jukebox in the Disney locker room, Mississippi State, but I guess they had some with music on it. When I was younger, they had what they called boom boxes. They were these big, I don't know if you know what those
Yes.
people take walking down the street or they take them on buses or whatever. Now obviously everybody's got stuff on their phone or this and that, and they got their earplugs in. But back then it's like they called them boom boxes because the guy would be walking down the street and everybody within 5 blocks could hear him if they were really blasting it. I think that's kind of what Sam was referring to. Because I'm a little older than Sam, but we're about the same age. He's 58, I'm 61. But anyway, Ty asked Sam about what he was listening to, and I was a little surprised Sam talked about Shaka Khan and Rick James and probably a bunch of other people you haven't heard of, and a band and this and that. And he mentioned that he played piano and guitar. Well, I'd never heard that. And so then Kyle Parkinson from the UA, he's a football SID, that's sports information director. I think now they're media relations directors or but basically there's somebody that he basically handles publicity for the football program. He handles, set up interviews for Sam and the players and running the Zooms and all these things. And so it was my time to ask another question. And I had a question about the fact that so many guys on Sam's staff had coached in the SEC East. I mean, Sam had coached at Georgia, Barry Odom coached at Missouri, their line coach coached at Kentucky. And so these guys had played in the East, you played Tennessee every year. Arkansas hadn't played them in 5 years, so you think, wow, Tennessee hadn't played Arkansas in a while. Now these players have faced Tennessee, which is true, but these coaches are very familiar with them because they all played them last year and the year before that. So they're familiar with Jeremy Pruitt. So that was my question in my head. But this is where I think you have to have a little flexibility. I mean, like I say, I think I go into interviews or, media days, whatever, with, 4 or 5 questions, but you have to be flexible. Coach says something interesting. You can't just say, well, my next question is on this and ignore it. So I said something like, well, I got to switch gears here. And so we got some more detail on how he'd taken music lessons growing up because their parents made everybody take piano lessons. I never took piano lessons. I'm very non-musical. As Sam pointed out when I asked him about it, did you play acoustic guitar or electric guitar? And he said, well, if you can play one, you can play the other. I think I said, oh, I'm not very musically inclined. He said, yeah, I could tell from that question. He was just having some fun. But he also, I think, was accurate. I don't know much about music and guitars and whatnot. And so, but I think that led to some interesting stuff that fans, would find interesting. I mean, obviously X's and O's and football and recruiting, but also you like to know some personal stuff, and you don't get as much of that now because, as we talked about, the access isn't quite what it was. And sometimes you think, well, I can't ask that question because that's kind of off the wall or that's kind of fluffy. I need to ask, some hard hitting X and O question about why aren't you playing so-and-so more, or why did you switch so-and-so to this position? But in this case, and Sam's a pretty engaging guy, so we just talked for a few minutes about, him playing. He said the Welsh prom. He was talking about Welsh, Oklahoma, WELCH. When he said it in my ear, I heard Welsh, like I think England, like Welshman. Yeah. And I couldn't quite tell prom. I just heard him say something like Welsh something. I thought, well, is he talking about like a music festival where they play well? It was very odd. I thought, and that's why, since, we're not talking like me and you were talking, and you can say, well, what do you mean by that? Or I can say, well, what do you mean by that? You're on the Zoom call. And so before the next question goes, I wanted to sort of clarify what he was talking about. Well, it was good. The Welsh Oklahoma prom. You can picture a young guy and his buddies playing at a prom in Oklahoma when they were in high school or college or whatever. And so, yeah, I think that was interesting. I think Tom used that in his notes today. I think they were talking about it on the radio just now. And I think that's, I think sort of, it's obviously lighter. It's kind of funny. I think people like that. I mean, whether it's showing it on TV or radio or newspapers or websites, whatever, it gives you a little insight into somebody beyond football. Hey, Sam, plays the piano and plays guitar. So I think that stuff's interesting.
Yeah. This is just a question that just came to me while you were talking about that, and you're talking about the fans being interested and stuff like that. And I feel like when it comes to sports, you have a very wide variety of fans. You've got fans that are just interested in stuff like that, off the field, the personal stuff, that's complete enjoyment. And then you have people who are really into it and really educated on it and want the X's and O's and the numbers and the details. As a writer, how do you manage that going into an article, and what audience are you trying to write to?
Well, I got to admit, so I'm going to take a little swig of water here.
Oh, you're good.
It just kind of depends. I think you need to go into an interview or a story with an idea, and maybe you stick to that, or maybe you deviate from it a little bit. You kind of have to know. We try to plan things at the beginning of the week. We have a budget, and it can be flexible because there can be news that breaks. Somebody can get hurt. Somebody can leave the team. A coach can say something unexpected in an interview that leads you, wow, I need to do a story on this now. Like I said, somebody else, like you're on the Zoom call and you're asking all these great questions that I hadn't thought about. And it's like, well, I don't know if you want to call it stealing an idea, but if it's on a Zoom call, it's all out there for free.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of anybody can use it. And so you have to be flexible, but, like I may have a plan. I'm doing like a feature story on this player or this aspect of the team. Maybe they're doing well at this position, or, something on the run game or something on the pass defense, whatever. And so I'm going to do that for Friday. And I kind of know in my head, well, we kind of talk about inches, like that's 25-inch story. Other people talk about words. That's an 800-word story. That's, whatever. We kind of deal in inches where literally, like, you have the newspaper page, you can take a ruler and you say, okay, well, this is 12 inches, 12 inches, that's 24-inch story, and you kind of get an idea of what that would look like on a newspaper page. We have the replica on the iPad or the phone now. We still print a few papers every day, and then we print a big section on Sundays because we still get a lot of ads. But obviously, print is decreasing dramatically around the country just because of just the way it's presented. But and then other stories, you say, okay, I'm going to do what we call a takeout, or that's a major feature. Like maybe it's going to be 70 inches, which is about 3 times what a normal story would be. Obviously, you can get a lot more stuff in a 70-inch story than you can in a 25-inch story. So you kind of have to decide. What I do is I get all my quotes. Like I'm doing a story. Last day I'm doing a story for Saturday. Tomorrow's paper. Tom writes the advance, and then I write what we call kind of a secondary story sidebar. I'm writing about Hudson Henry and Blake Kern doing pretty well tight end because that was kind of a question mark coming in. And so we had asked Sam about that on Monday. I asked him a little bit more, another question on Wednesday. We talked to Hudson on Wednesday night. I asked, Hudson had a good game against A&M, so I asked Jimbo Fisher about Hudson on Wednesday. And that's where you're kind of careful, because sometimes a coach, he's ready to move on, or, he might not remember a certain play. I think like Jimbo was on there. He talks very, very fast, by the way. So you get a lot of questions on Jimbo in 10 minutes. He talks extremely fast. And so I think I just said something like, hey, Hudson Henry, number 82. A lot of times coaches and players, they know more guys more by number than name. And so I said, hey, Hudson Henry, number 82 from Arkansas, had a kind of a career game against you. Just wondered, what you remember about that. And he might say, I'm focused. We're playing Georgia. I'm focused on Georgia. They're not playing Georgia, by the way. I can't remember who A&M's playing. But, or they did okay. That's fair. But a lot of times those coaches want to be accommodating if they can be, I think. And so he said, oh, yeah, he kind of laughed, said, oh, thanks for reminding me. And I'm thinking, well, you won the game, so I think it's okay. I didn't say that. But then he said a couple things like, hey, very physical, very good player, this and that. that's kind of what I mean about trying to mine every little possible nugget you might be able to get. And, if he doesn't say something, hey, okay, at least you asked, and maybe you would. And he said something very good about Traylon Burks. So
Mm-hmm.
different. You never know what you're going to get from a coach. But so anyway, so last night I was organizing all my quotes files so that I'll probably start writing when we get done with this, and that way I've got everything lined up. And I think I have a good angle idea from some of the quotes. Hudson's a good quote. Hunter Henry's brother who's with the Chargers,
Mm-hmm.
and he talked about the pressure coming here and playing the same position as his brother was an All-American. He's very open about that. So I'll probably write something about that. But if he had said something like he played music, which I didn't know, I might have gone in that direction. So I think you kind of have to be ready, and then you have to see where the interview takes you. But depending on the space and the day, you sort of have to know, well, I can't, use everything I got here. I got to sort of pick and choose what I think is good because I'm writing, about a 25-inch story here as opposed to, man, I'm writing a 70-inch story. I can get all this stuff. And that's another thing. I think people tend to think they got to use everything they get.
Mm.
And that'd be nice if it was like a Q&A, but really you have to figure out my job or, the job that people do like I do is to sort of pick what you think is the most interesting stuff so the reader doesn't have to watch, all these Zoom interviews and say, well, what's going on here? They get that unfiltered that way, whether it's news or sports or whatever it might be. But, this way you sort of have to know, well, what's my angle for that day? What's my space? And then you can do that accordingly. If you're going to do a big 70-inch story, you probably have to do some extra interviews and just get more stuff. But I remember in school, they used to tell us, if you use 20% of stuff you might use 20% of it. You may think, wow, I got 80% of stuff I'm not using. Well, one, you might use that for another story. And two, that's just the cost of, gathering information. And that 80% might be okay. The 20% you're using is really good. It's gold,
Right.
It's really great. And so you can't just overload people with information. Sometimes I think people tend to think, well, I've got to get that in there because I have it. Well, you don't have to. Just use your best stuff.
And that's where your notebook comes in handy. You save it for later.
Yeah, well, basically, it's all in my Gmail account. We do the writers, since we're all getting the same thing. We transcribe stuff and share it because it just saves you time. Because transcribing a 20-minute interview can take an hour. At least it can for me. So we divide it up and do 3 or 4 minutes, and that way, everybody's got it. But yeah, there's definitely stuff that sometimes I'll look up. It was funny. We did a story on Traylon Smith, who's a running back. He transferred from Arizona State, redshirted last year, and he's had, and he's had a really good year. He played quite a bit. Rakeem Boyd, their star, was hurt, and Traylon's played quite a bit. And we interviewed him in the fall in the preseason camp. We call it fall camp, but it's in September or in August. So it was preseason practice, whatever. And he was a really good interview talking about, redshirt and what it meant to him. And last year they had raved about him early. And this was, the previous staff. Some of these guys weren't even here anymore. Matter of fact, the running back coach, Jeff Traylor, is the head coach at Texas San Antonio now. But I went back, I found my files about what people said about him. And so I used some of that and said, hey, a year ago, he was redshirting, but he was doing real well in practice, which is closed. So we could but everybody was talking about how good he was. And so I used some of that stuff from a year ago. And normally you say, well, that's kind of stale. I don't need to use that. But I thought it was topical. The teammates and coaches from last year were talking about how good he was. And now it's going to come to fruition. You're going to see how good this guy was because he was finally going to get to play. So sometimes I do go pretty far back, and sometimes I'm going on the archives, from 20 years ago and looking up stuff I wrote because I don't remember what I wrote 20 years ago. I just sort of thought, man, I remember writing a story. I don't really remember the details. I'm going to read that, and because you might be doing a look back story,
Mm-hmm. I've always been curious because you talk about how there's all these different writers that are on the Zoom calls, and I've always been curious how you guys, or how as a writer you set yourself apart, because each of you is getting the same interview. You're getting the same sound bites from the coaches, the same information, and then you all have to go write a story. So how do you find those pieces that set your piece apart from the 20 other writers that are getting the same stuff?
Well, I don't know if it does or not. And in my case, the game's over. like from A&M, you try to look and analyze. Obviously, there's stuff you wrote Sunday, there's stuff you wrote Monday for follow-ups, and we do a big rewind notes, and that's sort of. I just remember thinking, oh, wow, Hudson Henry had a career game, and you on a road game, especially with time constraints, like if it wasn't for the coronavirus, we'd be there. And Tom was there, but he's up in the press box on the Zoom, just like I'm sitting here right here. I'm in this exact same place where I'm talking to you doing the Zoom. But if it wasn't, if it was normal, we'd travel, we'd go down to the interview room. Sam Pittman would come in, talk for 12, 15 minutes, whatever it might be. Usually they talk a little bit longer during the day at a home game, but at night, they got to fly home. So Sam's got to go out and tape his TV show and stuff. I think they do that. And so, and they might bring like 3 or 4 players into the interview room, then you spread out and kind of get them. Well, now because of the Zoom, like we got Felipe Franks for about 10 minutes the other night. We got Bumper Pool for about 10 minutes. And those were the 2 natural guys to interview. But so you're getting Sam for like 12, 15. So that's a long time. That's about an hour when by the time you get them in and interview them. So, they got to fly home to Fayetteville. And so, like we couldn't get Hudson Henry, which I totally understand, because you're not interviewing 5 or 6 guys, you're getting 2 guys because of the time constraints and because of everything's got to be done via Zoom. And so I remember thinking, well, Hudson would be a good story. So I sort of thought about doing that this week. And then, other people, if they want to do that, they can put their own spin on it. But, and some people, wrote about the tight ends for Tuesday after what Sam talked about. That's perfectly fine. Because somebody else might ask about the linebacker, and I might say, well, hey, that's a good story. I'm writing about that for tomorrow. But by sort of waiting, I got, a little more stuff from Sam. We got stuff from Hudson. I asked Jimbo about him. So hopefully by the end of the week, my story will be have a little more layers to it, so to speak. But yeah, you're right. We're all getting the same stuff. And sometimes you might call a player's, high school coach. Maybe you talk to their parents. Maybe you talk to somebody they played with who's no longer on the team. Or, another thing you can do is like we had Rakeem Boyd on along with Hudson the other night. And you can ask Rakeem about the tight end. You can ask the defensive guys. They go against these guys in practice. Hey, you might ask a linebacker, what do you think about Hudson? So, we talked to Blake Kern back in September before the season started. He was a former walk-on who got a scholarship last year. Mm-hmm. And I went back and looked at that. We wrote some stuff at the time, but I went back and looked at that interview, even though it was pushing 2 months, just to kind of get some background. So I think you just try to fill in some spaces here and there and just kind of put your own take on it. One thing I'd really try not to do, I like to read other people's stuff, information, but if I'm going to write on that topic, I try not to read it till later because I don't want to read something and then it gets in my head and then I start thinking, well, I thought of that. And I write it and it's really like, well, no, actually that was somebody else's lead. It's almost like plagiarism or something, not intentionally. But so I want to get information, but I also kind of try to keep my head clear because if you read too much stuff, then it's tough to write your own angle too, so sometimes.
Mm-hmm. In Mr. Tim's class, we always talk about, and in any sort of sports reporting, we always talk about how sports is the story of the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. I forgot who said it, but it's a famous quote from somebody. And so as a writer, I'm just curious, do you have a preference or is one of those easier to cover, the victory or the defeat?
Well, yeah, that was on the Wide World of ABC's Wide World of Sports back in the 60s. I don't know who said it either, but you could probably Google it. They always show this poor skier going down the slope and then crashing and probably breaking his leg or something. But I don't know who said it. It might have been Jim McKay was the guy who said it on TV. I don't know if that was his line or some guy wrote it for him or that was from somebody else. But anyway, well, I think it's always more fun to cover victories. There definitely can be really good storylines and, sort of tragedy, I mean, there's different degrees of tragedy. I mean, losing a football game, that's not like real life where people get injured or killed or something. I think you have to keep that in perspective. I know some people treat football games like life and death, but and I know it's big business. There's a lot of money at stake. People's careers can be at stake, but you also have to realize, hey, yeah, that was a tough loss. Nobody died. Let's try to keep, football tragedy or sports tragedy and real life tragedy, those are two different things. I always kind of try to stay away from war analogies in sports because, we have, young people fighting, defending our country around the world. And I'm not saying I never use like a war analogy, but I really try to stay away from those because to me, war and battles and all that's you can talk about a position battle, but I really don't like to invoke war images for sports because, I almost think that's disrespectful to people serving our country. That's just sort of a personal thing. Not saying I would never do it, but I don't like to make a habit of it because I think it sort of is a little disrespectful personally, honestly. But I think it's always, I covered 20 straight SEC losses. It was a lot more fun to write about them beating Mississippi State and ending that streak. And before that, I covered 17 straight SEC losses. I never thought I'd have, and I remember when they beat LSU, that was a lot of fun to write about them winning. And we talked earlier about you can't be a fan. I'll tell you, coming back to that, well, what I get to be, I get to be a fan of angles, story angles. And like you talk about, I don't root for this team or that team to win, but let's say a guy gets hurt and a little known reserve goes in and starts playing well. Well, I want that guy to keep playing well because that could be a great storyline. That could be that could make my job a lot easier after the game, writing about so and so going in there and really saving the day and stepping up and all that. So I sort of write for story angles to keep developing if I think that'll be a good story. Now, this guy goes in and has 3 good runs, and think, wow, that could be a good story, and then he doesn't do anything the rest of the game. Well, gee, so much for that. And, anybody that's been doing this for any amount of time, writing on deadline, can tell you about having a whole story written, because the team's up by 2 touchdowns, because this guy's playing great, like the quarterback's playing great. You're writing a story about how great the quarterback's playing. You got it written, basically. All I got to do is fill in the quotes, get a few post-game quotes, fill in. Well, all of a sudden that guy throws a pick six and throws another interception. They lose the game. And all of a sudden your story that you wrote is meaningless. It's just, you basically got, it'd be like if you were writing on paper, you just take it out of your typewriter and wad it up and throw it away. Now we just hit the delete button on our laptops. And, so, definitely, especially if you're on a night deadline, you're rooting for that storyline to keep going your way. And a lot of times it doesn't happen. You've got to just be professional and deal with it. Your initial thought is to just be upset and mad, maybe even be mad at the player, which is totally unfair. But you can say, man, why is this guy doing this? Why is he doing it to me? And it's like, well, he's not trying to do it. And by the way, he's trying to win the game for him and his teammates and his coaches and his fans. But you sort of have everybody looks at how does this affect me, right? And so as a writer, sometimes it's not right, it's not fair, but you might even get frustrated with a player because, oh man, he's messing up my story angle, which I'm sure the player could care less about your story. At least try to win the game, but we all tend to internalize everything that happens, and I don't root for a team, but I'll root for a storyline.
Do you ever save your what if stories that you have to throw out?
Yeah, because usually I save everything. I start typing in my file and then I call it, UA site or whatever whatever topic it might be. And so it's in my files. Every once in a while you can use you might be able to save a lead or something or a story angle and it might apply. That's probably pretty rare, but yeah, I've got a zillion files on my computer that a lot of them I probably haven't looked at in years. A lot of times when the IT guys are doing work out there, amazed at all the stuff I have in here, and I'm like, well, it's just sort of like you never know when you might need it, So don't kill it out if you have the space to save it.
Is there one sporting event or one story from your whole career that stands out as one of your favorites that you got to do or write?
I can't remember if I talked about this in your class or not. Back, Danny Ford was the football coach. They fired Jack Crow when he lost the Citadel to open the season in 1992. And Joe Kynes became the interim coach. And because there was an opening on the staff because Jack got fired, he brought in Danny Ford, who'd worked with at Clemson. Danny was pretty famous. Danny'd won a national championship as Clemson's coach, and they kind of got crossways with the chancellor or president there at Clemson, and he basically took a big buyout. And one thing, he could come to Arkansas and be an assistant coach, and he didn't lose any of his buyout. He only lost the buyout if he became a head coach. Mm-hmm. And he still had, 6 months to go on his buyout, and they were paying him a lot of money, not to coach the team. That happens a lot these days with these contracts, And so Danny Ford came in, excuse me, and Danny ended up getting hired at Arkansas. And it was after that buyout. I remember looking up his contract and talking to guys at Clemson. I knew exactly when that contract expired, so I knew exactly when he could get hired and not lose the buyout money. It was after the season. And so Danny got hired and took the job. And Danny's a really good guy. He's I don't know if you call him a gentleman farmer, but he has a farm in Pendleton, South Carolina. And he was always really smart with the stock market and everything. He kind of acted like he was just he was all academic. I think it was an academic All-American when he played Alabama for Bear Bryant. So Danny was a very sharp guy, but he kind of acted the country. That was sort of his persona. And he obviously had a Southern accent. He was from Gaston, Alabama, I believe. But anyway, Danny, Arkansas's program was down then, kind of like what they were when Sam came in. They hadn't been quite that bad, but they'd been bad. They'd come into the SEC. They really weren't ready for it. And they'd struggled. They were coming off that, I think it was a 3-7-1 season. That's before they played 12 games. And so Danny was trying to build up fan interest. That's something he'd done at Clemson. They had this thing called IPTAY, which was sort of their Razorback foundation. It was called I Pay 10 a Year. And it was kind of dated because it started maybe in the 50s. And the idea was you had grassroots support. Yeah, you had your big boosters, big businesses that gave, thousands of dollars, maybe millions, but you also had to have your grassroots support where, a Clemson fan who maybe just had a regular job, he'd pay $10 a year to be an IPTAY, which was their booster organization. And it was sort of like, yeah, I'm not giving, $5,000, but I can pay $10 and I can be part of the program. And then as time went on, people gave a lot more than $10, but that IPTAY was, and they may still have IPTAY, I'm really not sure, but that was something Danny decided to do. He decided to do a tour around the state because he was new to the state. He was from South Carolina. And I don't really think he came to Arkansas to get the Arkansas job. I think maybe he wanted the South Carolina job. But bottom line is the Arkansas job got offered to him. He wanted to get back into coaching. And so he was the Arkansas coach kind of unexpectedly. And so they had this thing where RVs, I didn't know what those were at the time. They're recreational vehicles. And I'm not talking about an SUV. I'm talking about these things are like big. They're like big mobile homes. They're big. I could never imagine driving one. And there was about, 7 or 8 fans that had these big RVs. They'd go around to the games. Instead of having to get a hotel, they just go to an RV park. These things are like big trucks, and they got everything in them, bathrooms, kitchens. They're just basically like little houses on wheels. And so Danny, they worked out this thing with the Razorback Foundation, and he made about 25 stops in about a week. They'd go all around the state to these small towns for the most part. And because, he spoke in Little Rock all the time or this. So he would go speak somewhere at a breakfast deal, like at the Rotary Club or something. Then he'd speak somewhere at lunch. Sometimes he just went to a bank or something. It was almost like a politician in the 50s getting up on a soapbox and talking to people. He was basically campaigning for Arkansas. And he was trying to get people to join the Razorback Foundation. And I think it cost $25 at the time to join the foundation. And, you got press guides and different things. Mm-hmm. And I think at the time they were like running a sale, so to speak. You could get it for $10. That was his big pitch. And he had this big saying, he's a farmer, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Mm-hmm. Meaning what comes first? You support our program and your support helps us win? Or do you have to wait for us to win to support us? His whole thing was, hey, get on board with us now. Basically be the chicken so we can lay the egg that helps, the program. I thought that was pretty interesting, because I guess that's an age-old question, which did come first, Right. Somebody had to lay the egg, but, how did that happen? I don't know. That's smart enough. But it was really interesting. So the paper, I can't remember if I pitched it or somebody else pitched it to me, but they said, hey, why don't you go along on this tour and just kind of write about Danny? Because Danny was still very new to the fans, and it was kind of a way to get behind the scenes. And like I said, the access was better. And so
Mhm.
I talked to some folks, and I was able to ride in one of the RVs. I drove to Fort Smith and met him. And then we all drove down to Lake Village, Arkansas, which, if you look on a map, is way down on the Louisiana border. And I don't, that was a place normally an Arkansas coach. You also got to remember it was a big deal because the Arkansas coach did not go to places like Lake
Mhm.
Village very often. And so uh, Danny had just been at the SEC coaches meetings. He flew a school plane to Lake Village. They picked him up at Lake Village Airport, and man, away we went. And Frank Burrows, the AD at the time, who hired Danny, obviously he was a legendary coach. He was on part of the trip. There was 4 or 5 people, and Danny just kind of would be in different. He'd switch different RVs, so he kind of got to know the people. But and then at night we drive into some place. I don't know, like Forest City or something. I can't even remember where all we went. And you stay at the Days Inn in Fort Smith, or not Fort Smith, Forest City. And so, like I said, he was doing 3 of these a day, and it was really interesting. And so I just tagged along with them, and then I took notes everywhere he went, and I sort of made it a diary. And we did this is kind of like I'm talking about the takeout. We had a big map of Arkansas, and we had all the places he went with like a little RV, and it was pretty cool. And I almost wrote like a travel diary, like here's what he did. And there was all these funny things that happened, like this is before the days of cell phones. It's hard for somebody your age to imagine, but you had to use a pay phone or an office phone. I remember we went to a bank somewhere, and Danny went into like the loan officer's office to make some calls. Call recruits. I don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was calling coaches. He was he had stuff to do, and so he goes in there, and also this is before people's pictures were plastered all over the place all the time. So I'm just kind of hanging around. I might have been. I don't think I was in the office with him because he's probably making some private calls. But I was just hanging around the lobby of the bank. It was a small bank, and so somebody knocks on the door. They go in the office. They think Danny's the loan officer,
Oh.
and so they start asking all this stuff. And Danny has to say, "Hey, I'm Danny Ford. I'm the coach." He's introducing himself. He's trying to convince them to join the Razorback Foundation. It was pretty funny. And there was another time we were checking into one of the small motels, and it was raining. And some ladies came in, and they were talking about they had a flat tire. And so they were just asking if they could hang out in the lobby. They were waiting for somebody to come change a tire for them. And Danny, he's an old school guy. He basically offered to change the tire for him. They didn't know who he was. It was clear they had no idea he was Danny Ford, University of Arkansas coach. It was a pretty big deal in Arkansas. And he said, "Hey, ladies, where's your car? I'll go down and change a tire for you." They said, "Oh, no, we've got AAA coming out," or something like that. But that was an interesting little slice of life moment. These ladies, Danny didn't say, "I'm Danny Ford from Arkansas, I'll change your tire." He just said, "Hey, so there was just a whole lot of things like that. And it made a really good story. I remember feeling some pressure because I normally write, 7, 8 stories a week.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, I went on the road and I didn't write anything for a week. And then I had, so I'd basically taken up, a week of, the paper's time. And, in our business, there's a lot of pressure, to produce, on a daily basis. And so this was sort of that oddity. So I felt a lot of pressure, but I thought it was a really good story. I won an award for it. Like I say, the layout was really good. We started out front, and then it took up, I think, the whole back page or whole page inside somewhere. And it got a lot of good comments. That was probably the funnest story I did, most fun, whatever I should say grammatically there, because it was just so different than what I would usually do. Sorry that was such a long story.
Oh, no, you're good. I love it. I love it. Just real quick before I let you go, what's one little piece of advice that you would have for someone that wanted to get into the sports industry as a writer?
Well, one thing I did when I was in college, I was from Cape Girardeau, but I was in Columbia, Missouri, which is in the middle part of the state. But there would be kids from, that would come to college at Missouri that would play sports for, whether it was baseball, basketball, whatever the football case might be. And the Southeast Missourian, which is still a paper down there in Cape, I would call them and I'd offer to write stories for them for free, which I know nobody really likes to do stuff for free. I don't either. I get that. But to me, that was a way to break in and get clips, as we call them then. And I'd write a story about some, Sykeston, that's a town about 30 miles south of Cape, and maybe the starting shortstop in Missouri was from Sikeston or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd call up and say, "Hey, would you guys like a story on so and so from Sikeston?" And they'd say, "Yeah, sure. We can't pay you." I was like, "Yeah, that's okay." I mean, to me, the payment was to get the clip in the paper. One thing, my parents got to see it, so that was kind of cool, and my friends could see it. And two, it was something I could take to hopefully get jobs. Because what you want to do back then, now you'd have emails or whatever, and online stuff. Back then, you literally would cut it out of the paper and then you put it in a book. That was your clips book. Say, here's a story I did. So I would encourage people to just reach out to local media and offer up your services. And if they say, "Hey, we'll pay you a little bit for that," that's awesome. If they say, "Well, we can't pay you for that," because obviously money's tight with everybody, you say, "Hey, I'm just looking for experience." So, sometimes experience can be more important than money. That can help you get a job that'll, pay you some money. So I think, just get out there and try to, get experience, whether you're in, radio or, podcasts, whatever you might be, like what you're doing now is, to try to get some experience, try to think outside the box a little bit. But just I think the more experience you can get doing this, the better. Because when I was starting off, I wasn't particularly good at it, and there are probably some people that say, "Well, you're not very good at it now either." But I'm a whole lot better than I was, when I was in college. And a lot of that is just getting used to doing things. So I think the best thing I could give advice would be just try to get out there and get some experience, and don't worry so much about the money. But just try to get some experience of what you're doing, because obviously the more experience you're going to get, hopefully the better you'll get at it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I could sit here and talk Razorback sports all day long, but I'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining me. It has been a pleasure.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed it too.